People tell you it's a normal phase when a child, reeling from the aftershocks of a fractured family, invents a friend. You're supposed to see it as a healthy coping mechanism, a sign of a resilient imagination at work. You're supposed to play along, to nurture the fantasy until it withers on its own. I did all that. I listened, I smiled, I asked the right questions. But what do you do when the fantasy starts leaving footprints? What do you do when the whispers you hear in the walls at night start using your son's voice to say things no child should know? Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely.
The house smelled of lemon polish and 100 years of dust. For Sarah, it was the scent of a new beginning, a costly but necessary anchor in the storm of her recent divorce. The old craftsman-style house, with its wide porch and heavy oak door, was more than she could really afford. But every late night she spent hunched over her laptop as a remote paralegal was a payment toward this sanctuary, for her and for Leo. Her 7-year-old son, Leo, was a whirlwind of creative energy, a boy who could build entire civilizations from Lego bricks and chart galaxies with crayons. But since his father had moved out, a quiet loneliness had crept into the corners of his bright personality. He needed this house. He needed the stability of his own room, a yard to get muddy in, and the illusion of permanence. "It's a castle, Mommy," he declared on moving day, his voice echoing in the empty living room. "A giant wooden castle." Sarah's heart had swelled. "It's all ours, sweetie." For the first few weeks, it was perfect. They painted his room a cheerful sky blue and spent evenings on the porch swing counting fireflies. The house sailed around them with gentle groans and creaks, the comforting sounds of a home breathing. Sarah, sleep-deprived but content, felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest finally begin to loosen. Then came Mr. Wicker. It started innocently enough. Sarah was making dinner, the rhythmic chop of her knife on the cutting board, a familiar comfort, when Leo trotted into the kitchen, a serious expression on his face. "Mr. Wicker doesn't like carrots," he announced, pointing a small finger at the pile of orange discs. Sarah paused, a smile playing on her lips. "Oh, really? And who is Mr. Wicker?" "My new friend," Leo said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He lives in the walls." Relief washed over Sarah. An imaginary friend. Dr. Spock and a dozen parenting blogs had prepared her for this. It was a textbook response to trauma and change, a way for Leo to process his feelings of loneliness. She knelt down to his level. "That's nice, honey. Is he friendly?" Leo nodded solemnly. "He's very tall and scratchy. He's made of dry leaves and sticks." He held up his hands, wiggling his fingers, and he's very, very quiet. The description was peculiar, a little morbid for a 7-year-old, but Sarah filed it away under childhood eccentricity. "Well," she said, ruffling his hair, "you can tell Mr. Wicker that we are having carrots for dinner." Over the next week, Mr. Wicker became a constant, silent presence in their lives. Sarah learned more about him in disjointed fragments offered by Leo. "Mr. Wicker doesn't like loud noises," Leo would whisper when she turned on the vacuum cleaner. He'd sit on his bedroom floor for long stretches, perfectly still. When Sarah asked what he was doing, he'd say, "I'm playing a new game. Mr. Wicker taught me. You have to be so still that you look like a tree." Sarah played along, finding the whole thing quaint. It was a game, a narrative Leo was building to feel safe. The house was old. It was easy to imagine a scratchy man living in its walls.
The creaks and groans she heard at night were just the house settling, but for a boy with a vibrant imagination, they were the footsteps of a secret friend. She even started leaving a glass of water on Leo's nightstand for Mr. Wicker, a gesture that made his son beam. She was so focused on Leo's psychological well-being, on seeing Mr. Wicker as a symptom of a healing mind, that she didn't pay enough attention to the house itself. She dismissed the faint, earthy scent that sometimes hung in the air in the upstairs hallway as a draft from the attic. She ignored the way the shadows in Leo's room seemed to deepen and stretch as evening fell, attributing it to the old, wavy glass in the window panes. One evening, as she was tucking Leo into bed, he looked at her with wide, serious eyes. "Mommy?" "Yes, sweetie." "Mr. Wicker says, thank you for the water. He was very thirsty." She smiled, pulling the covers up to his chin. "You're welcome, Mr. Wicker," she whispered toward the wall. Leo's smile was huge and genuine. "He says he likes you." A chill, brief and unexpected, traced its way down Sarah's spine. She shook it off. It was just a game. A harmless, imaginative game. She kissed her son's forehead, turned on his rocket ship nightlight, and closed the door, leaving him to the company of his new imaginary friend. She was grateful for Mr. Wicker. She had no idea she was nurturing a viper. The inciting incident didn't come with a bang, but with a whisper. A dry, furtive sound that pricked the edges of Sarah's consciousness. It was 2 a.m. A major project brief was due, and she was mainlining coffee at the kitchen table, the only light in the house coming from her laptop screen. The house was a tomb of silence, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Then she heard it. Scrabble, scrabble, rustle. It came from the direction of the living room, from the wall that backed onto the main staircase, the wall that ran all the way up to Leo's bedroom. It was a thin, chitinous sound, like a handful of dead leaves being crushed slowly, or a large insect dragging its brittle body against plaster. Mice, was her first thought, or maybe a squirrel had found a way into the wall cavity. It was an old house, after all. Annoyed, but not alarmed, she made a mental note to call an exterminator, took a long sip of her cooling coffee, and forced her attention back to the legal document on her screen. The sound did not repeat. But Mr. Wicker's influence was deepening. Leo's playtime became more insular. He'd spend hours in his room, the door closed. Sarah would walk past and hear him whispering, a low, constant murmur. When she'd knock and enter, he would fall instantly silent, his eyes wide, a finger to his lips. "Mr. Wicker is shy," he'd explain. "He doesn't like being interrupted." One afternoon, while putting away his laundry, Sarah noticed a small wooden cigar box tucked away in the back of his closet. She'd never seen it before. Curiosity overriding her sense of his privacy, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like old cotton batting, was a strange collection. There were a dozen twigs of varying lengths, arranged from shortest to longest. There was a pile of brittle, brown leaves, a beetle's iridescent carapace, empty and delicate, the desiccated, paper-thin body of a dead wasp. "What's all this, honey?" she asked gently when Leo came into the room. He rushed forward, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "They're presents from Mr. Wicker." He snatched the box and held it protectively to his chest. "He likes things from outside, things that are quiet and dry." The explanation was so childlike, yet the collection was so macabre. It felt less like a boy's treasure box and more like an offering. An unsettling feeling, cold and heavy, settled in her stomach. She told him to make sure he washed his hands after playing with dead bugs and tried to forget about it. The real shift, the moment her carefully constructed rationalizations began to crumble, happened a few days later, It was a Saturday. She'd spent the morning deep cleaning the house, a frantic burst of activity to combat her rising unease. Leo was in his room, quietly playing. She had locked the windows that morning after airing the room out, a habit ingrained from years of city living. The door had been closed the entire time. When she went in to tell him lunch was ready, she stopped dead in the doorway. There, on the interior windowsill of the locked window, was a small, perfectly constructed pyramid. It was made of 3 dried brown leaves and capped with a single sharp twig that pointed towards the ceiling. Sarah stared at it, her mind racing, searching for a logical path. There was none. The window was locked from the inside. She had been the only other person in the house, and she hadn't been in his room. Leo was sitting on the floor, his back to the window, engrossed with his toy cars. "Leo," she said, her voice strained, "how did those leaves get on your windowsill?" He didn't even turn around. He said, "Mr. Wicker put them there." "Mr. Wicker put them there. It's a present from me." She walked over and touched the twig. It was real, dry and brittle. She looked at the window lock. It was securely fastened. She looked at the screen on the outside. It was intact. There was no hole, no draft. A cold dread, far sharper than the fear of any rodent, began to seep into her bones. The house was silent, but for the first time, it didn't feel empty. She was standing in a locked room with her son, but she had the terrifying, impossible feeling that they were not alone. The presents weren't just going one way anymore. Mr. Wicker was giving gifts back. Mr. Wicker's rules began to encroach on their life like a creeping vine, strangling the normal routines of a mother and son. The entity's influence was no longer benign or playful. It was prescriptive, controlling. One night, Sarah served Leo's favorite meal, macaroni and cheese. He took one look at it and pushed the bowl away. "I can't eat that," he said, his lower lip trembling. "Why not, sweetie? You love this." "It's too noisy," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the wall. "Mr. Wicker says the sound of it in my mouth is like a storm. He only likes quiet foods." From then on, Leo would only eat soft things: bread, bananas, yogurt. The crunch of an apple or a cracker would send him into a state of visible distress. The vacuum cleaner, once a source of mild annoyance, became a monster. The moment she turned it on, Leo would clap his hands over his ears and retreat to his room, slamming the door. The fear was primal, absolute. Sarah's attempts to reason with him were met with a blank stare. Nighttime rituals changed too. He began insisting with a frantic urgency that his closet door be left ajar. "That's how Mr. Wicker comes out to play," he explained, his voice hushed and reverent. "He unfolds from the corner." Sarah, trying to compromise, would close it after she thought he was asleep, only to find it open again in the morning. The physical phenomena escalated. The dry, rustling sounds in the walls were now a nightly occurrence, no longer confined to one area. They skittered and scraped behind the plaster, a constant, unnerving soundtrack to her evenings. Sometimes they were punctuated by faint, dry tapping, like a long fingernail drumming impatiently. One morning, she found it. A long, thin scratch mark gouged into the wood of Leo's bedroom door, starting near the knob and dragging upwards. It was too high for a child to make, too thin for an animal. It looked as if a sharpened branch had been deliberately drawn across the paint. The air in Leo's room grew heavy with a peculiar odor. It was faint but persistent, a smell of dry, disturbed earth and decaying leaves, like a forest floor in the deep of autumn. It clung to his bedding and his clothes. It was the smell of the entity's growing presence. Worn down by stress and a gnawing fear she couldn't articulate without sounding insane, Sarah made an appointment. Dr. Finch was a child psychologist with a kind face, a soothing voice, and an office filled with calming beige furniture. Sarah sat on the edge of a plush armchair, twisting the strap of her purse, and laid it all out. The new house, the divorce, the imaginary friend, the rules, the secrets, the scratch on the door. She tried to sound rational, like a concerned mother, not a woman losing her grip. Dr. Finch listened patiently, nodding in all the right places. When Sarah finished, the psychologist offered a reassuring smile. Sarah, everything you're describing is, in its own way, perfectly normal. Imaginary friends are incredibly common, especially during periods of significant upheaval. Leo has experienced two major life changes, his parents' separation and the move to a new home. He's lost a sense of control. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. Mr. Wicker is a classic transitional object, a psychological construct. By creating this friend with his own set of rules, Leo is creating a world he can control. He decides what Mr. Wicker likes and dislikes, and by extension, he's carving out a space for himself that feels safe and predictable. But the leaves on the windowsill, the scratch. Children can be surprisingly resourceful when they want to make their fantasies feel real. It reinforces the narrative for them. He could have hidden the leaves in his pocket and placed them there when you weren't looking. The scratch could have been anything, a toy, the buckle on his belt. The mind, especially a parent's worried mind, is very good at finding patterns. The diagnosis was gaslighting by prescription. Every fear she had was neatly pathologized, repackaged as a symptom of her son's understandable anxiety. The advice was to gently engage with the fantasy, but not to indulge it too heavily. Acknowledge Mr. Wicker, but gently reinforce reality. Reassure Leo that you are his primary source of safety and comfort. Sarah left the office feeling both foolish and more terrified than ever. The doctor's calm, clinical dismissal made her feel utterly alone. She was being told she was hysterical, that the monster in her house was a figment of her own stress-addled imagination. But as she drove home, she couldn't shake the image of that scratch on the door or the earthy smell of decay clinging to her son's room. The doctor had given her a rational explanation, but her instincts screamed a different truth. A boundary had been crossed, and something was methodically, patiently laying claim to her child. The shift, when it came, was brutal and swift. The entity was no longer content to be a secret confidant. It began to actively sever the bond between mother and son. Mr. Wicker started providing counsel, dark and divisive whispers that came out of Leo's mouth. Mr. Wicker says, "I don't have to listen to you," Leo stated flatly one evening when Sarah told him it was time to put his toys away. There was no defiance in his tone, just a simple declaration of a new truth. "That's not true, Leo. I'm your mother." "Mr. Wicker is my real best friend now," he replied, turning his back on her to whisper something to the wall by his closet. The emotional blows grew sharper, more precise. The entity seemed to know exactly where Sarah was most vulnerable. The ultimate attack came during a minor disagreement over screen time. Sarah had told Leo he'd had enough for the day, and he needed to turn off the tablet. He looked up at her, but his eyes were not his own. They were cold, ancient, and appraising. A chilling emptiness stared out from her son's face. "Mr. Wicker says you're not real," Leo said, his voice a dead monotone. "He says you're the one who is imaginary. You're just a bad dream I'm having." The words struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. This wasn't her son's anger. This was a calculated cruelty, a psychological weapon designed to shatter her. She saw it then, with horrifying clarity. She wasn't just fighting for Leo's obedience. She was fighting for her very existence in his mind. The entity was trying to erase her. The next day, she found the drawing. It was on his little art table, sketched with black and brown crayons. It was their house. A small, simple stick figure of Leo stood in his bedroom window. Outside, on the lawn, was a crude drawing of a woman with blonde hair like hers, but a thick, angry black X was scrawled over it, obliterating her. The truly terrifying part, however, was what filled the rest of the house. Drawn inside the walls, its form coiling through the structure of the home, was a massive, spidery figure. It was impossibly tall, its limbs like tangled branches, its body a chaotic scribble of brown and black that mimicked leaves and sticks. Two of its long, thorny arms reached protectively around the small figure of Leo in the window, cradling him within the house's frame. It was him. It was Mr. Wicker. And in Leo's mind, he owned the house. He owned the boy. Sarah was the outsider. The rustling sounds were no longer just ambient. They now had a clear point of origin. The attic space directly above Leo's bedroom ceiling. The scratching was louder, more frantic. Armed with the terror that had finally burned away all hesitation, Sarah pulled a chair into the upstairs hallway, reached up and yanked on the cord for the attic ladder. It unfolded with a groan of protest and a cloud of stale gray dust. She grabbed a flashlight from the linen closet and climbed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air that hit her was thick, suffocating, and smelled overwhelmingly of dry rot, dust, and that same earthy decay from Leo's room, only 100 times stronger. The flashlight beam cut a weak path through the oppressive darkness. The attic was a graveyard of forgotten things, but her attention was drawn to the far corner, directly above where Leo slept. There, between the wooden joists, were strange, deliberate constructions. There were nests, large, tangled piles of dried leaves, twigs, brittle grasses, and scraps of newspaper yellowed with age. They looked like the layers of some enormous, unnatural bird. As she swept the light across the floor, she saw that the old pink insulation had been torn away, shredded, and pushed aside, creating a clear space directly over the plaster of Leo's ceiling. It was a listening post, a viewing platform. Her light caught something else, a flicker of movement. From the deepest, darkest eaves of the attic, something retreated. She didn't see it clearly, just a suggestion of immense height, a lanky, disjointed shadow pulling itself back into a space that seemed too small to contain it. The flashlight trembled in her hand. This was its den, its nest, and it was standing in the middle of it. She scrambled back down the ladder, slammed it shut, and stood in the hallway gasping for breath, the terrifying image of the drawing burning in her mind. The monster wasn't in the walls. The walls were the monster. Rationality was a luxury Sarah could no longer afford. Dr. Finch's clinical assurances were ashes in her mouth. The entity in her house was real, and it was tightening its grip. Terror gave way to a desperate, feral need for answers. She spent the next 2 days in a feverish haze of research, neglecting her work, subsisting on coffee and fear. She started with the town's digital archives, her fingers flying across the keyboard, searching the property address. The results were sparse but unsettling. The house had changed hands frequently over the last century, often sold after only a few years. She found a clipped newspaper article from 1958, a grainy photo of the house under the headline, "Local Boy Vanishes, Community Searches." A 9-year-old boy named Thomas Miller, who lived in the house with his widowed mother, had disappeared from his bedroom one night. He was said to be a lonely, imaginative child. His window was found open, but he was never seen again. The police concluded he had run away. His mother, the article noted, was later institutionalized after suffering a complete mental breakdown, claiming something in the walls had whispered her son away. Chills raked Sarah's body. It was too similar, a single parent, a lonely child. She dug deeper, moving beyond the house itself to the history of the land it was built on. A local historical society's online forum provided the next piece of the puzzle. An elderly member, a self-proclaimed town historian, responded to her vague query about local folklore. He wrote about the old legends, the stories told to scare children before the town was much of a town at all. He spoke of a wicker man, or a stick man, a regional boogeyman, a spirit of the woods that was said to be drawn to loneliness. It wasn't a ghost of a dead person, he exclaimed, but something older, more elemental, a hungry spirit that would offer friendship to lost children, luring them with secrets and games until they belonged to it completely. He mentioned that the part of town where her house stood was built on what used to be old, dense woods, cleared out in the early 1900s. The name solidified her terror, Mr. Wicker. It wasn't a name Leo had invented. It was a name that had been whispered to him. The final, horrifying piece clicked into place. Mr. Wicker wasn't a ghost haunting the house. The entity wasn't tied to Thomas Miller or any single tragedy within the home. It was older. The house had been built on its territory, and it had simply incorporated the structure into its being. It was a parasitic genius Loki, a spirit of place gone hideously wrong. It couldn't create, but it could influence. It couldn't build, but it could inhabit. It imprinted on the most vulnerable residents, the lonely, the imaginative, the children who already felt like outsiders. And it fed, not on blood or life force, but on devotion. It offered them the one thing they craved, an unwavering, possessive friendship. In return, it demanded everything. It would isolate the child, turning them against their protectors, ensuring its own eternal companionship. The parent wasn't a threat to be eliminated, but an obstacle to be discredited, to be made imaginary in the child's mind. It wasn't trying to kill Sarah. It was trying to replace her. She looked at the wall of her quiet, charming house, and for the first time she understood what she was up against. She wasn't fighting a haunting. She was fighting a god, a small, territorial god of sticks and leaves and loneliness for her son's very soul. The pretense of subtlety was over. The entity, perhaps sensing Sarah's newfound understanding, grew audacious. It was no longer content to whisper and scratch from within its plaster and lath cage. It wanted the run of the house. One night, Sarah was jolted from a shallow, restless sleep by a loud crash from downstairs. It wasn't the familiar groan of the house settling. It was the sharp, violent sound of breaking glass. Her heart leaped into her throat. An intruder. She grabbed the heavy metal flashlight from her nightstand and crept out of her room, her every nerve screaming. She tiptoed down the stairs, her breath held tight in her chest. The living room was bathed in the cold blue light of a street lamp. The source of the noise was immediately obvious. The large window next to the fireplace was not just open, it was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a hole in the center. But it was the trail that made her blood run cold. Leading from the broken window, across the hardwood floor, and stopping at the base of the stairs was a path of dried brown leaves and small brittle twigs. They were scattered as if shaken from a massive unseen garment. The earthy, autumnal smell of the attic now filled the entire first floor. It hadn't broken in to take something. It had broken in to prove that locks and glass meant nothing to it. It could come and go as it pleased. Desperate, Sarah had bought a cheap motion-activated security camera the day before and placed it on the bookshelf in the upstairs hallway, aimed at Leo's door. After calling the police, who found no signs of a human intruder and logged it as an act of vandalism, she shakily reviewed the footage on her phone. The video was mostly grainy, silent darkness. Then, at 3:17 a.m., the camera clicked on. For a split second, the image was a blur of static. Then it focused. Moving from the direction of the attic ladder and past Leo's door was a figure. It was a moving silhouette, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long and its joints bending at unnatural angles. It didn't walk. It moved with a jerky, stop-motion gait like an insect trying to mimic a man. The shape was unmistakable. It was the spider-like creature from Leo's drawing, brought to horrifying life. It paused at her son's door, which was slightly ajar, and a long stick-like arm reached out, its shadowy fingers tapping once on the wood, before it receded and stalked silently down the hall out of the camera's view. Sarah's resolve hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. This thing would not have her son. She tried everything she could think of. She called the exterminator she'd first considered weeks ago. The man came, sprayed for pests, and declared the house sealed. That night the rustling was louder than ever, and the earthy smell returned, stronger, tinged with a chemical bitterness, as if mocking her. She bought sage and burned it until the house was thick with smoke. She bought crucifixes and hung one on Leo's door. They seemed to have no effect. The entity was not demonic. It was something other, something pagan and primal that didn't recognize her symbols. In a fit of rage and desperation, she climbed back into the attic and tore the nests apart, stuffing the leaves and twigs into trash bags. She swept the floor clean, her movements frantic. She felt a malevolent stillness watching her, a cold pressure in the air. That night, she slept fitfully on the floor outside Leo's room. In the morning, when she dared to look back in the attic, the nests were there again. Not just rebuilt, but larger, more intricate, woven with a defiant architectural precision. The entity was not just a presence. It was intelligent. It was territorial. And it was treating her desperate attempts at banishment as a game. The endgame began on a Tuesday night. The air in the house was electric, heavy with a sense of impending climax. Sarah was trying to coax Leo to eat his dinner when he looked up at her, his eyes holding a dreamy, distant glaze she had come to dread. "Mr. Wicker has a surprise for me," he said, his voice soft and melodic. "He's invited me to play a special game tonight, a forever game of hide and seek." A cold dread coiled in Sarah's stomach. "What kind of game, Leo?" "He wants me to come live in the walls with him," Leo said with a serene smile. "He made a special door for me. He says we can be best friends forever and ever, and we'll never be lonely again, and you won't be able to find me." Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis. This was it, the final move. Later that night, feigning sleep, she watched from her cracked open bedroom door as Leo, moving with the sleepwalker's eerie grace, opened his window. A rope made of knotted bed sheets was already tied to his bedpost. He was about to climb out, not to run away, but to be collected. She ran to his room, but she knew a physical restraint wasn't enough. She couldn't just lock the window. She had to sever the connection. She had to confront the entity at its source. Leaving Leo crying and confused in his room, she turned toward the attic ladder. This would not be a fight of force, but a battle of will. She climbed into the suffocating darkness, the flashlight beam her only weapon. The presence was overwhelming. The cold was absolute, a physical weight that pressed in on her from all sides. The wrestling was no longer a whisper, but a deafening roar, 1,000 dry leaves and sticks churning in the shadows around her. The nests were bigger, almost reaching the rafters. The air vibrated with an ancient, possessive intelligence. In the deepest corner of the attic, a shadow detached itself from the others. It unfolded, rising to an impossible height, its form a shifting mass of sticks and darkness, just as she had seen on the camera. It had no face, but she felt its ancient, malevolent gaze fix upon her. It wanted her to be afraid. It fed on fear. It thrived on the terror of a helpless parent. But Sarah was done being afraid. A fierce primal wave of maternal love, hot and unyielding, surged through her, burning away the cold. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She held her ground, raised her chin, and spoke, not to the monster, but through it to the small boy it held captive. "Leo!" she shouted, her voice ringing with the strength she didn't know she possessed. "You remember the beach? Remember the feel of the hot sand and the cold water on your toes? Mr. Wicker can't give you that. He doesn't know the smell of the pancakes I make you on Saturdays. He wasn't there when you learned to ride your bike and scraped your knee, and I was the one who cleaned it and kissed it better." The rustling faltered for a second. The towering shadow seemed to shudder. She took a step forward into the heart of its nest. "I am your mother, Leo. I am real. Our love is real. This thing is just a shadow. It's empty and lonely, and it wants to make you as empty as it is." She spotted the small wooden box of presents Leo had collected sitting on a joist like an altar. With a cry of rage, she lunged for it, grabbing the pathetic offerings, the dead wasp, the twigs, the beetle carapace, and crushed them in her fist, the dry pieces turning to dust. "These are not presents. They are lies," she screamed into the roaring dark. "He doesn't love you. I love you." She poured every memory, every ounce of her fierce, unwavering love for her son into that cry. It was a psychic anchor, a beacon of pure, selfless emotion in a place of selfish possession. It was a force the entity could not comprehend. Fear, loneliness, despair, that was its food. This pure, unadulterated love was poison. The towering figure recoiled as if struck. A sound tore through the attic, a dry hissing shriek of 1,000 things breaking at once. The overwhelming cold vanished, replaced by the attic's normal musty heat. The deafening rustling faded to a faint, retreating whisper, then to silence. The entity, faced with an emotional power it could not consume or corrupt, had broken. It had retreated, slinking back into the deepest, forgotten cracks of the house it inhabited. Downstairs, a piercing cry broke the new silence. "Mommy!" Sarah scrambled down the ladder and ran to Leo's room. He was huddled on his bed, the trance broken, tears streaming down his face. He flung himself into her arms, sobbing, clinging to her as if he had just woken from a long and terrible nightmare. She held him tight, her own tears falling freely, and knew with absolute certainty that she had won. The silence in the house was profound. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home, but the vacant, watchful silence of a defeated battlefield. The walls no longer whispered. The air was clear of the phantom smell of autumn decay. The entity was still there, she knew, coiled in the foundations and the ancient timbers like a dormant parasite. But its influence was gone. Its connection to Leo was severed. They didn't stay another night. Sarah packed a single bag with their essentials, buckled a sleeping Leo into his car seat, and drove to the nearest sterile, anonymous motel. The next day, she called a lawyer, a realtor, a moving company. Breaking the mortgage and selling the house at a significant loss was a brutal financial blow, but it was a small price to pay for her son's soul. She never looked back. Months later, they were settled. Their new home was a modern, characterless apartment in a high-rise building with thin walls and neighbors they could actually hear. It was perfect. Leo was thriving. He was enrolled in a new school, making real flesh and blood friends. He was louder, messier, and more wonderfully chaotic than ever before. He never spoke of Mr. Wicker. When Sarah had cautiously broached the topic once, he'd simply looked at her with confusion, mentioning only that he used to have a lot of bad dreams in the old house. The memories, it seemed, were buried, smoothed over by the resilient mind of a child. One rainy Saturday, Sarah was finally unpacking the last of the boxes from the move, the ones labeled Leo's Art and Keepsakes. At the very bottom, beneath old school projects and finger paintings, was the drawing. The house, the stick figure of her crossed out, and the monstrous spidery form filling the walls. Her first instinct was to rip it to shreds, to burn it and scatter the ashes, to annihilate the last physical remnant of their ordeal. But she hesitated. She looked at it again, her eyes tracing the crude crayon lines. And then she saw it. It was something she had missed in her terror, a detail so small it was almost invisible. In the bottom corner of the page, tucked away near the edge, was another tiny stick figure. A little boy, holding the hand of an even smaller stick figure of a woman. They were standing together, separate from the monstrous house. A wave of emotion washed over her. Even when he was in the entity's thrall, when his conscious mind was being turned against her, some small, defiant part of Leo had still been holding on. Some part of him had been drawing them together, safe, outside the nightmare. She didn't destroy the picture. She carefully folded it, creasing the paper so the monster was hidden, and tucked it away in the back of her own memory box. It was not a trophy, but a reminder, a testament to a battle she had fought and won, and a quiet acknowledgement of the small hand that had been reaching for hers all along, even in the dark. Enjoy the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.